All right. Think of a famous story. Don't share what it is. Yes. Think of a famous story. Do not share what it is. And now, the villain is a twin of the hero. Now, how would that affect things? Let's see. Depends on the story you thought of, right? The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West, is actually Dorothy's twin. Could make sense. That'd be kind of interesting. Maybe you age faster in Oz in a situation like that, right? Obviously, you have Harry Potter. Voldemort is Harry Potter's twin, actually. In some ways, it's similar to what she ended up doing, though, right? With a piece of his soul being part of Harry Potter, which linked the two together. So, essentially, maybe she started with a story prompt like this. Think of other famous stories. What if the villain actually was the twin? What if they were directly related in such a way? And this certainly bears in mind when we're thinking about writing and making our protagonist link to our antagonist or to our villain. Because, you maybe don't need a family link quite that strong, but certainly you want them to be linked enough that perhaps the villain is a little enticing to the protagonist. It's very nice too when the villain can represent who the villain can represent who the protagonist might become, right? The way that they could end up becoming. I looked at that a little bit with Emma last week in a book fight and how that worked out. All right, let us move on. Picture the worst place you'd ever want to visit. So let's say somebody's like, I want to take you on a vacation. And you're like, not there. What is that worst place? What is the place that you would like to visit less than anything else? What would be the worst possible thing you can imagine? Just horrible. And now, ask yourself what would make it the best place to visit? What could you adjust about it? And I'd like to see your comments. How can you transform the place that you like the least into the place you like the most? And what does that say about the situation? Now, in terms of writing our own stories, it's always good to keep in mind setting, right? Setting impacts the story in such strong ways. And sometimes just a little bit of a tweak of a setting can make it much more interesting from a tension standpoint. And it's like a dystopia, right? A dystopia is often a utopia for some people, and it's just a dystopia for other people. So it's cool to think about what makes the setting great for somebody and what makes the setting terrible for somebody. Because then you have two different viewpoints on the same setting, and you can create a lot of tension with the characters because some people really like the place where they're at, and some people hate it, and then they can battle it out. Lots of fun to watch. Look at this music. Now this is making me want to go out on the beach or something, which is definitely a nice place. Be an emotional thing too. Maybe your least favorite place to visit is some in-laws house because of just the tension, or a family member's house just because of the tension. And what would make it a best place to visit is, well, they behaved in a different way, right? Not necessarily a physical way. All right, let's move on. Write down a title of a story. All right, we're going to do this again. So think of a famous story. A story that you know. It could be a movie or it could be a book. Any type of story. All right, think about it for a moment. Don't share what it is. Just think about it. All right, and now, does anybody die in the story or is dead at the beginning of the story? It's a common way to begin, especially stories with young protagonists. Often their parents are dead to make them more vulnerable, or obviously a lot of time within stories you have people die in order to raise the stakes. So, does anybody die in this story? Certainly, at the very least, there's somebody dead at the beginning of a story, since there's some ancestor or some previous lineage that is talked about. So, with that in mind, ask yourself this question. What would happen if it turned out they never died or were always alive? How would that affect the story? Imagine how many stories are built upon the premise that it's important that the characters are dead. Like Harry Potter, for example. Pretty important. Um, in Star Wars, if Luke's mother didn't die, be a very different story, right? And keep that in mind in terms of how you frame the deaths and the fatalities in your story. Either the ones that happen off screen or off page before it starts, or the ones throughout your story. Every time that you throw this in the mix, it should matter. Now, you might think of a story where somebody dies in it, and if they don't die, nothing really changes that dramatically. Maybe they were helpful to the protagonist along the quest, and they kind of made things more interesting by dying, or they made things a little more difficult, but it wouldn't turn out all that differently. Be careful of writing deaths like that. Be careful of killing off characters for no other reason except to raise the stakes. You don't want what's often called red shirts or cannon fodder in your books. You don't necessarily want people that are around just to raise the stakes. Although, some genres it's a little more acceptable than others. Horror, often, people are pretty okay with the idea. But it depends. Even in that genre, though, usually the deaths matter. They point to some thematic point, or they're limiting the options of the protagonist. They're different people that are helping the protagonist face off against whatever threat is befalling them, whatever horrific monster or whatever force it is. They're helpful allies that just keep getting knocked out to make it seem worse for the protagonist. All right, write down a noun. Don't share what it is. So we're going back to the Mad Lib days. Think of any noun. Don't share what it is. All right. Do you have a noun? Have you thought about it? All right. And now, why did you put blank into the time machine? So put that noun in there. And what do we got? All different kinds of responses. Yes. Why did you put your dog? Why did you put a dog into the time machine? Interesting. Maybe you're trying to repopulate the species. Maybe it's extinct. Maybe it's a special tracker dog. Imagine a world in which only dogs can handle a time machine, or animals that are maybe not as complicated as humans. Although biologically, I'm not sure if that really works, but let's just say for the purposes of the story that you can only put in some animals and not humans. And so then you have to train dogs to do things because you're still trying to meddle with time. Because I don't know, why else would you have a time machine unless you're going to meddle with time, right? That's the whole point of it. So you send a dog back in time, and they've got a little helmet cam on them, and you're watching the color cam, and they're walking through whoever's palace. That could be the old trope where you're trying to go back in time and kill Hitler or something, and there's they're walking through with their little collar. That would be one of those things, especially if you're talking about something with high emotional stakes like that. It would be such a weird juxtaposition of something that is almost humorous with something that obviously doesn't have a lot of humor in it at all, and would be kind of a fun. I like things that kind of can ride in that space, right, where there's something silly about it and yet very serious at the same time. That could be fun for the audience as well. Why did you put a phone into the time machine? Yeah, maybe you're sending an invention back. Maybe all we can send is objects. And then you send an object back so that can communicate something to the past in some way. That would be interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, thank you for joining us today for Brainstormer. I hope that you enjoyed some of these writing prompts, sentence starters, something got your creative juices flowing. Who knows? Maybe you came out of this with a few ideas for your own story. tomorrow we are going to be doing our AutoCrit Live Power Hour, and I'll be hosting a show with Beth and some of the other team members, and we'll be talking about AutoCrit Live, all of our shows, plans for the future, a little behind the scenes, and what we are intending to accomplish with all of these shows and how you can use them to help your writing. So that'll be tomorrow at Tuesday at 1 p.m. At 7 p.m., we are going to have Pitch It. Now, Pitch It is where you can come in with an idea for a story, and then you can find out from us if we think it'd be a good idea, if it would be a bad idea, or maybe things you can affect about your story. Or if you've already written a story, maybe you're trying to sell it and then you want to see, does this make you enticed to want to read the story? Is this an effective elevator pitch to an agent? You can do that as well, and you can give us that blurb, as it were, the sort of thing that would go on the back of your book cover, and find out, would we read it or pass on it? We also have tomorrow evening Book Blender, and Book Blender is where we take elements from stories, protagonist, antagonist, setting, story prompts, and we try to create a story on the fly. So if you want to join us with that, that's 10 p.m. Eastern. So great for those of you on the West Coast. And fun way to spend your late evening on the East Coast. And we have a lot of fun with that. The first episode, if you haven't had a chance to see that, we had Snoopy versus the Borg in the Museum of Natural History, which was a lot of fun. And really, we end up with some interesting things to think about by the time we get to the end, that distill it down into something from more of just a fun, silly sort of exercise to some real engaging story prompts that can affect your writing as well. So thank you so much for joining me on AutoCrit Live, and I will see you in the future. Bye, everybody.